Hello.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good, and how are
I'm
you?
good, and how are you? Good.
Good. Just
Good.
waiting
Sorry.
for
Just waiting
you to join.
going. What'd you say?
So we'll get started
So
in a
we'll
few
get
minutes.
started in a few minutes. Yep. I'm just trying to get the points up.
I can't hear you too
I can't
well.
hear you too well. Yeah? Should I go and get an earpiece?
Up to you. I mean, you don't have any
Up to
background
you.
noise.
I
It's
mean, you
just that
don't
I'm
have
not
any
hearing
background
you.
noise. It's just I'm not hearing you. Okay. Maybe I can use my mic and connect in. Right, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Right, so the mic
Yeah.
is closer.
Oh, okay, okay, great. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us again today for an IG Live. And today I have another colleague with me, and this is Riza, and I'm going to let her introduce herself a little bit. Briefly tell us who you are and what you do, and tell us a bit about your organization, because I see that you have a counseling service.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Brenda. So, hi everyone. My name is Riza Khan. I am a counseling psychologist as well. Brenda and I would have studied together. So,
Mhm.
we have stayed connected at almost 2 years now. We've been practicing, which is crazy. Um, so, I'm Guyanese and I would have returned to Guyana after the program. And I would have worked with an LGBTQ agency here as their psychologist, on-call psychologist. I went on to also support the St. Joseph Mercy Hospital here in Guyana as their on-call psychologist. And during that process, there was an offer to be a psychologist for an international company. So they were like, you need an office. So I was as nervous as I was as a fresh psychologist. I decided to make a NIRA Counseling and Psychological Services, which can be found on Facebook. I don't have it on Instagram. There's just too many things to manage because there's the
Mhm.
YouTube. I also have a YouTube page called Mental Health Yourself. And so I have my own office here in Guyana. Um, Obviously, with COVID right now, most psychologists, at least in Guyana, and I think globally, have kind of gone online. And so a lot of people are still messaging and saying, oh, where do you do therapy? I said, oh, online right now. That's what I've been kind of working with. So I've been focusing primarily on my own practice, which is Amara Counseling and Psychological Services.
Great. And I thank you for coming on board with me today and for joining me today.
Yeah.
Today we want to look at suicide risk, and I thought that you would be a good person to bring in, especially because of where you are from, which is
Yeah.
Guyana. And I know that Guyana has a lot of high suicide rates. Now, of course, we're not
Yep.
actually going into in depth in terms of suicide, but we're looking at the risk factors, especially as it relates to COVID-19, right? So at least I want to get some of the perspectives from Guyana as well so that we can see, across the region what's really happening and what people are feeling, right?
Right.
So let's get right into the discussion then. So why have a discussion surrounding suicide during this time? You want to go first, or you want me to
I think,
go?
well, for me, as someone
Uh-huh.
who I got into mental health, really, like I went into the program, I was motivated to go into the program because the suicide rate in Ghana was skyrocketing in 2014
Mm-hmm.
and 15. It wasn't new, anything to me, but basically we put a lot of effort into it in 2014 and 15. Hence, I went into the program. But suicide is kind of a plight to the history of Guyana. And so, given the circumstances with COVID, we understood that this would be an increased likelihood or a certain factors that would contribute to a increase in suicides in
Mm-hmm.
Guyana at this time, among other social issues, um, which we'll talk a little bit about. But
Yeah.
definitely suicide, and particularly in Guyana, like murder suicide is a big
Mm-hmm.
issue, and we have actually seen the numbers going up in about 3 weeks or so, as anticipated, with specifically murder suicides.
Right. See, so I thought that it would be really good to have you on so that we can have this discussion. And now that you're talking about that, so some of the effects of the pandemic on mental health, and of course, quarantine is one of them, and fear and anxiety. And as we're talking about quarantining, and you're talking about murder suicide, would you say that for Guyana, would it be murder suicide as it relates to spousal or would you say it's more of adults? Is it more involving children and families? How would you categorize it in Guyana?
In Guyana, historically, we have persons who, a full range, like 14 to, I suppose, in the 30s, and then we kind of have a break, and then we have a population of much elder persons that we're not really talking about. But currently, we're seeing it's mostly adults, it's mostly IPV, intimate partner violence, that is then resulting in suicides. So like I said, in the past 3 weeks, we've seen a few of those, and they're specifically related to murder suicides. And yes, that is related to the violence. And it does have to do with the quarantining, in the sense that you are locked up with a perpetrator of violence. Someone who may not be able to cope well, someone who may have anxiety, someone who may have a history of alcoholism and those kinds of things.
Substance abuse, yes, and that is very important. I mean, because I think you and I were talking, I think last week, and you were commending Barbados, I think, because we had banned alcohol, because substance abuse is something that can really trigger someone, especially within close quarters in quarantine. And so you were commending Barbados on that fact. As well as I liked that you mentioned in terms of being isolated with people in close quarters. And then especially when we look at that, we have to think about people who do not regularly get along well together in close quarters as it is. And then having to actually be home with them.
I think what we have taken for granted as a protective factor, whether you're involved in a domestic violence situation or just a highly toxic home, for both adults and children, is that school has been a protective factor, work has been a protective factor. Okay, my children go off to school, I get to now tend to the things I have to, I can focus. My perpetrator or my toxic partner goes off to work, I don't have to see or deal with them or talk to them for 8 hours a day. If they engage in substance use, they're probably going to go and drink after work anyway, so tap on another 2, 3, 4, 7 hours after work. So you're really not interacting with these members of your family in comparison to how much you're really interacting with them now.
Yes, and how much you're being forced to interact with them now. Yes, it's true.
Yes.
And then when we're looking at the suicide, when we're discussing suicide on a whole, we find that there is a stigma related to suicide. And people do find it difficult to talk about suicide with others. I mean, even I think when we were training, I can't remember if it was that you would, or is it that I read it somewhere that some people were saying that, as psychologists, we should not mention suicide to our clients because it's like you're putting the idea in people's heads.
That was a myth buster, yes. We were myth busting.
Because I tend to, especially in my assessments and everything, when I'm dealing with my clients, it's actually a question that I do bring up about suicide, because I think it's something that, and I'm not saying to normalize it per se, but I think because it is happening, even though it may be happening behind closed doors and a lot of people are not aware of it, it is prevalent, especially in the Caribbean.
Yep, and I tell persons, that in the beginning when I'm doing the consent form and stuff, I explain to them the current and planning of intent to harm themselves or someone else. And I tell them straight up, your past doesn't matter at this point in time. It matters in the sense of it's good to know if you have self-harmed, but it doesn't, I don't have to breach any confidentiality for that. So I let them know flat out. If you have a history of harming yourself, don't feel that you can't tell me about it, basically. But and I always tell them this part of the ethics and this part of the consent form is intended to protect you. It's intended to keep you safe and keep other people safe. And so it is. I do remember that class where we're like, to tell or not to tell, especially
Yes.
with adults,
Yes.
young
Mm-hmm.
adults with adolescents, because they're
Mm-hmm.
technically non-consenting and are
Yeah.
consenting to their parents. And we were like, so should we give them a heads up? Should we not? But then I think what it came down to was that we should let them know, because it's better for them to know and make a decision whether to open up to us or not. Or be like, oh, well, I didn't tell you, but anything you talk about suicide in a realistic, planning-oriented way, I have to breach confidentiality and your
Mm-hmm.
trust. So
Yes.
I remember that class.
Right.
Right. So in terms of suicide, I know that a lot of people, and why we brought this up, and then the first question you asked was, why is this such an important topic at this time?
Mm-hmm.
Because we are literally separated from persons that are also part of our protective factors. Not only are we stuck home with persons who may be of some potential harm emotionally, mentally, physically, but we are not as connected to our support systems, whether it be our family, our co-workers. I
Our
have many
friends.
clients, many
Mm-hmm.
friends, many clients who their co-workers are actually a major chunk, and their workspace, their office has become a huge part of their coping,
Safety.
normalizing, safe
Mm-hmm.
space. And so
Mm-hmm.
now the persons don't have that. There's definitely this sense of helplessness,
Yes, agreed.
right?
And then stigma. When we talk about stigma, I mean, there's already a stigma towards mental health as it is, but there's also stigma as it relates to suicide. And maybe those two who may have, as we were discussing previously, contracted the virus and don't have it anymore, there'll be a stigma towards
Right,
that. Being welcomed back into the fold per se, in terms of family, in terms of work, in terms of any sort of social environment, right? And
right,
that stigma may exist as well for people like that, and therefore they can be at a risk for suicide.
right, exactly. Almost like the lepers, the
Yes.
new lepers of society.
Hmm.
And I think that that's what, for example, and we talked about this, the example of Jamaica. Is there any Jamaicans on here? But the jingle that Jamaica came out with was specifically geared towards not just education of what the virus was, but to me, I got a sense of it was more for breaking down the stigma, because the video shows that a man is going to lash a woman because she has COVID and and he's chasing her, and it's the woman comes out and says, this could be your sister, this could be your wife, this could be whoever, trying to get across
Hmm.
that anyone can get COVID, and that we cannot discriminate or threaten to harm or to mistreat persons who may have contracted the COVID-19.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. So there's
And we
definitely been efforts to deal with that.
Yes, it's true. It is true. And we were talking too about people in suicidal crisis who may require special attention because it is something that they would require special attention for. And I know
Right.
previously in Barbados, like when we first established that hotline, that crisis hotline, well, not really a crisis hotline, but the hotline to call in if you had symptoms and if you were exhibiting and not feeling well and not to go to emergency rooms, etc. And then people were
Yeah.
having problems with reaching anybody because the lines were so busy constantly. Now I know that for sure that has diminished a lot for us here. How is that
Right.
in Guyana?
In the beginning, we like persons were reporting that they did get through. There were some issues pertaining to people saying, "Oh well, because how it is," and I'm sure it's kind of the same way in Barbados. They're all using the PAHO like criteria, and so they're like, "Okay, cough, no, fever, yes." Sore throat, no, sneezing, yes. And so they would, if you didn't meet certain symptoms, they would just say,
Mm-hmm.
well, it's a cold. Call back in, a week or whatever, or
Mm-hmm.
stay at
Mm-hmm.
home. Don't go to your doctor, or that kind of thing. The problem with that, using it as a criteria, because this virus is not black and white. There are people who said they did not have breathing problems until like 2 days before they died, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not a one size fits all. And so the problem with that is there were a few people who died because I think Barbados and Guyana have almost the same death rate. We were 8 with you guys the other day. We now have our 9th. And people did say that they were calling the hotline and either were told that they're not severe enough, it didn't sound like corona, or that they were not getting through. Someone said they'd called out several times, like I think the number was like 11 times before he was finally admitted to the hospital, and then he did succumb to his symptoms. So there is definitely still an issue with ensuring that the hotlines are working, and that people are still and people are still being offered the tests, you know, especially in severe cases, and also in the cases of persons who have succumbed, ensuring that their immediate family that they would have interacted with are tested as well.
Right, and getting that support as well. So let's go straight into some risk factors, because we have started to discuss some of them, because we spoke about the domestic violence, as you were talking about the murder-suicides in Guyana. Loss of employment and not being able to feed your families, that's a risk factor for suicide. And I'm not saying that people will commit suicide because of this, but there's also the suicide ideation. So thoughts, and I'm sure everyone would have been exposed to some kind of thoughts as it relates to suicide. So we're just looking at some risk factors as it relates to suicide. So loss of employment, it can be one risk factor. And we did speak about domestic violence. Anything else that you can think of? Or you want to add to that?
I think like loss of employment, but not in the sense of permanency, in the sense that there are persons who have been told, okay, well, go off for 2 weeks. And, you know, you'll get paid, but like a reduced, or people are coming in with reduced hours or that kind of thing. So it may not be that, oh, I've been fired altogether, but that there is that uncertainty. If I go off for this 2 weeks, am I coming back? Is this just you trying to get me, you know, out of the system? Are you just going to not bring me back? And so there's a lot of worry with if people are going to be able to even kind of retain their jobs if they're sent off for 2 weeks, or if they're only doing 3 days a week or 2 days a week, if you're not considered essential workers. And so that's definitely, it's not just the complete loss, which has its own form of grief and so on, but also concerns around, will this job continue long enough for me to even keep feeding my family and supporting my family?
And I'm glad that you raised that in terms of not just the complete loss, but in terms of reduction in staff workers. So that reduction in staff is also putting extra pressure on those who are still having to perform and still having to make sure that the work gets done. So it's the increased workload that is also a risk factor. And somebody also mentioned family history.
Oh, as in risk factor? Oh, yeah, of course, yes. Definitely risk. And I was explaining this. I had a suicidal person messaging me, someone last night or something, and I kind of just, one of the things that I said was, well, in not this way, but basically 50% likelihood that your children are to commit suicide if you commit suicide and die from it. So I kind of, it's a scare factor. It's not the best way to approach it. But people do have to know that your actions don't end with you in that sense. There's a high likelihood that children themselves go on to self-harm after one of their guardians have committed suicide and died as well.
That's a very true, very valid point. That is a very valid point, Raisa, I must say. And social isolation and loneliness. I know Asha and I would have had a discussion about loneliness and that kind of thing, but especially having to be forced to be away physically from people can create anxiety and worry and those feelings, and then that is a high risk for suicide as well.
Right. And I think we had mentioned this before in our discussion, but how does one's already concerns with their own mental health issues play into this? For example, clients who have some social anxiety might be like, oh, this is great, I don't have to interact with people. But persons perhaps who suffer with things like borderline personality disorder, the concept of abandonment and rejection is so strong that someone not responding to your text, or someone saying, oh, I'm too busy to video chat right now, can be life-threatening. And so we do have to consider the persons who do suffer with trauma or abandonment issues or fear of rejection and that kind of thing, how this separation or physical separation is.
So I thought that that was
Mm-hmm.
important to know.
Yes, very, very, very true. Um, I also had a point in terms of access to lethal means. Remember, we were discussing this last week, access to lethal means, and in terms of so medications or prescription medications, firearms, and you were mentioning some things about Guyana, especially as it relates to access to lethal means. So you can share that here with the group now.
So, a part of many of our mental health strategy plans have included a whole section on pesticide controls, um, because we have a history of persons attempting to commit suicide or self-harm with the means of pesticides. And so we have had a few measures put in place. So you have to be in a locked cabinet and only has one key, da da da. Those things are also not the best way of protection, because if the farmer has one key and the farmer is a suicidal person, he'll get to his storage. So even that is not perfect in itself. But the other way of which persons in Ghana have tried to commit suicide is by hanging themselves. It's actually very
Mm-hmm.
common. We also have a history of that as well. And so these are two particular ones that are very specific to Ghana. Yes, persons do use firearms. Yes, we do have persons who try to use, tablets and medication.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of pesticides, and we see a lot of hacking. And so
You're
we need
right, right.
mindful. And I think it's a lot of times it's about awareness that we're not watching our family members, we're not watching their behaviors, their isolations, their mood changes, and so we're not, oh, give the child their space. You give a child their space, but
Mm-hmm.
idle, and they will do something drastic, and we're not being
Yeah.
vigilant.
So not
Um,
noticing them withdrawing and yeah, turning inwards. Yeah, we're not paying, as you said, awareness. We're not paying enough attention to see these things. It is true.
right.
And the what you spoke about in terms of the access to lethal means, a lot of those I believe are systemic of the Caribbean on a whole, really, in terms of having access to pesticides, because I know that that used to be a big thing in Barbados as well in terms of pesticides and suicide.
Right.
And then you're speaking about the hanging and everything. So I think it is all systemic of the Caribbean on a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And so the social effects too is a risk factor. So in terms of those those of us who like to social gatherings in terms of religion. So, going to church and having that connection to your church family, your spirituality, and
Right.
gatherings at funerals, where you get to say goodbye to people and everything. All of those contribute to risk factors as well.
Right. Yeah. When we look at things like grief and the fact that grief is the several stages, is a process. If and many persons in the Caribbean, because we have our wakes, we have our processes, we have certain things that we like to do when someone has died. Um,
Mm-hmm.
those procedures are probably not going to be the same now with COVID.
Yeah.
Fortunately, because the numbers are smaller in the Caribbean thus far in terms of deaths, persons may still be getting to do a proper burial. We have
Right.
places in Brazil and the States that they're just putting mass graves and some not even marked. So you may not even know
Mm-hmm.
where they've been buried in some of these countries,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
large in the thousands and so on. But in terms of like the grand funeral and the grand wake, no, those things have been cut out from now what are considered very traditional aspects of the process of grief, and how
Mm-hmm.
those who may not have processed grief the traditional or the appropriate way for them, how does that impact their mental health, and their sense of uh, the desire to live?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
I totally agree. So it's really it's gonna end up having to find a new way to manage your grief as
Right.
opposed to the large gatherings and everything, because going forward everyone I think is aware that things will have to change. It can't stay the way that it was, because we still have to maintain the physical distancing and everything else that is attached with COVID. So it's going to come down to a new way of living, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Functioning.
A new way of functioning. Yeah, that's it. That's it. And somebody was mentioning here, this is regional integrated, and they were talking about there's really no real perfect way to plan
Yeah,
for
we know
access to lethal means, which is true.
I
Mm-hmm.
think it just needs to come down to education in the sense of like mental health education because
Mm-hmm.
the means will always be there and the means will always be there. Someone could do, and like you said, consider other forms that they may try. There's several ways to try, so we can't just be putting up roadblocks everywhere, you know. But yeah, it is about education
Mm-hmm.
so that people have a less desire to self-harm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think we missed one bit, which was the media. And again, this is like a serious issue. I've done several media trainings for suicide over the years, and oversharing of the crisis, oversharing of suicide. In Guyana, we had I had to go and blaze up the whole media press about stop putting the amounts of medication. People like at one point in time they were putting the number of like the milligrammage of
Mm-hmm.
poison they took. Like why is that necessary? Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the sensitization to the topic is important, and also in terms of the crisis, in terms of COVID, people not just centralization, of
Mm-hmm.
happening, and more of information giving rather than um, just dramatic things to get a read on social media kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Yeah, we did miss that one media, but yeah, thanks for bringing it back up. And so then we can go straight into some tips or protective factors because I see Regional Integrative has also put up something and it's a support system, a solid support system, and that is really what is necessary,
Mm-hmm.
especially in this pandemic mode, COVID-19. A very important factor is a solid support system and
Yes.
having that support system operate in many ways. Now, for us here in Barbados, we have gradually started to open back up, and that is a whole other scenario, really. But I mean, now that we've opened back up, people are able to interact at least and see people physically as opposed to just online through a medium. But having that social support, that social connection is so important. So making sure that you reach out to people. I mean, if you message someone today and you realize the tone of the message doesn't sound as though the person is upbeat or it sounds as though they're very down, try to reach out. See if you could do a video call with someone.
Right, exactly. And again, that comes back to awareness and stuff like that. For me, I always, throughout this entire process, I've been doing a lot of videos on coping. So I was like, okay, suicide, this is different. Because I would definitely say disengage, know when you have saturated your fill of information or traumatic, and, if you're being re-triggered, knowing when to
Mm-hmm.
disengage with media, knowing when to disengage with social media, whatever it is. I think that's really important because I think that people underestimate how impactful hearing about death, hearing about the lack of PPEs, hearing about the struggles of the frontline workers, seeing the videos,
Mm-hmm.
them crying, hearing about how many people have had to die in the ICUs. I think people underestimate the impact that has on your mental health. And I think that if it is that you feel like you're feeling very overwhelmed or fatigued or sad all of a sudden, in you need to be able to recognize that maybe you have hit your level of absorption and that you need to disengage and go in
Mm-hmm.
re-engage in something more calming or positive, and not just COVID.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree. So sensitivity really on the part of media is needed as well. And to awareness of an individual awareness or being mindful of yourself, your body, and
Mm,
how you are taking on some of these visual images every day, or
yeah,
the content that you're allowing yourself to be
yeah,
exposed to on a
yeah.
regular basis. Yeah.
Stress is very bad for your health, so you have
Mm-hmm.
to realize that you do have to engage in coping mechanisms, coping skills that are going to be geared to keeping your immune system up, that are going to be geared towards keeping your mental health up. Because we do understand now that stress will impact your immune system, and it can, among the other factors, impact your likelihood of getting sick. May not be COVID, but it can be cardiac related stuff, or another cold a cold at this point in time can send you into panic mode.
Listen, I know.
I think that if you can try and keep your immune system up, your mental health up, your stress levels down, it'd be better for you in terms of not going into a panic thinking you have COVID. And for those persons, for example, when we talk about suicide, persons who may live with a lot of persons, one cold in a small home can really scare and send a whole family into panic. And like I said, if you have pre-existing mental health issues that causes you to not cope well, or be very panic-stricken, or have anxiety, or get very impulsive, that can be very dangerous. If the whole is to just believe that they have COVID mixed with stigma.
Yes,
mixed
agreed.
With the lack of support. It's not a good kettle of fish there.
Yes, agreed. And then, of course, like having a spouse or children, sometimes that can be a great motivator in terms of if that is your will to survive, your reason for being here. That's a really good motivator for some people. For some people, it's not, but for some, it is.
When you're doing crisis intervention for suicide, I'm always mindful of, well, do you have a family, or do you have children that would need you here? And I have seen that question go very wrong. And I've heard persons tell me that their crisis person asks them, oh, don't you want to live for your children? And it just spirals into, my children hate me. They want me to die too. So I'm mindful of how that question is directed. Let's be mindful of that. But indeed, our children can keep us somewhat focused in terms of getting certain things done. Our children have certain needs, so they need to get out. They need to get out into play, or they need to be supervised, or they need to be fed. And if you're someone who's suffering from depression and all you want to do is be bedridden, having children can at least try to motivate you to get out and get stuff done. Of course, it's very difficult. And when persons are so severely depressed that that is no longer motivation, then steps in guilt.
Yes.
As a mother or a guardian, or I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So we have to be mindful of seeing how motivation, pros and cons of having children and a spouse, right? Because if you have a spouse, that's not really good motivation.
Yes. And I will also suggest, in terms of those who are spiritually inclined to continue to practice your religious activities, I mean, even in this pandemic, I mean, there are many churches who are having their services online, or they're having Zoom meetings, Zoom calls, and try to connect that way, so that at least you can still feel that spiritual family that will help to keep you grounded as well.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it's very interesting because we had Navratri, which is a Hindu celebration, period a couple weeks ago, and now we have Ramadan. And so even in Guyana, kind of balancing, how do we fast during COVID? How do we interact during COVID? How do we have, because usually at the end of the day and the fasting, it's usually like when we're together,
right?
Large groups, 10 number when you're doing the fasting, the breaking of fast at the end of the day. So how are, even persons, and I know Barbados has Muslims. I've seen them, interacted with them. And so it's very curious as to, even in Barbados, how are the Muslim communities dealing well with, again, tradition during the COVID, how's that here to religious practices during COVID?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. Yeah. And too, there's another factor such as fear of death itself. So some people may actually fear death, and then
Right.
that can be a factor that would defer them from
Yes.
committing suicide as well.
Yeah. I've had a few clients say um, that that is what has kept them alive through the years.
Mm-hmm.
Fear of dying. They're like, I don't want to be
Fear
in
of
pain. I'm
them.
like, don't kill yourself. You know.
Mm-hmm.
um, it has helped for some people. And like we said, everyone's gonna have varying protective, right?
Yes.
So this is definitely one of them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
was there anything that we missed?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything. Does anyone have any questions for us at this point? Because we've covered everything that we wanted to cover. And today we were looking at suicide risk during COVID-19. And does anyone have any questions for us that they would like us to answer? I'm going to just scroll through some of the comments that were made before so that at least we
Or
can
you
mention
can
those.
try. Oh wait, I can see them. Yeah. Oh yeah, there was also not. It's not a tip, nor is it a protective factor, but something to
Mm-hmm.
consider is that after all this is said and done, yes, we've talked about how traditions will have to change. Some, burials, weddings, all that just stuff will have to possibly altered. But we did not talk about we're talking about suicide risk at this time, but there's still suicide risk even after COVID's done. There's
Of
things
course.
like divorce. Divorce may rise, domestic violence will rise. We have we had a discussion pertaining to persons who will come out of COVID with
Mm-hmm.
potential mental health issues like anxiety. We said OCD. I said hoarding. Um, and impulsivity and stuff like that. So there are also other potential mental health stuff that can occur even after
Mm-hmm.
COVID is gone.
Right.
Right?
Do you happen to know the crisis hotline for Guyana?
We have several numbers. What I could probably
Mm-hmm.
do is put it back on the Anira Counseling and Psychological page. I don't think I have it on hand right now, and I actually think it's in the phone that I'm using. So what I could do is probably either send you the copy or
You can
maybe
say
email.
what you remember any at this point in time, at least to call one. So at least no, don't know offhand.
I don't want to give
Yeah.
the wrong number.
Okay, no problem. But the one for Barbados, I can call Barbados. I can say Barbados one, which is we have a Barbados crisis hotline and it's 24 hours. So 435-8222. That's for Barbados. 435-8222. Or there's actually a number for text messages, which is 253-5071. And at any one of those numbers, when you call, you will get somebody will answer and they'll be able to talk to you. It doesn't matter what time of the day or night, they will reach out and they can talk to you. So that's for Barbados. I know we also have one for women, like the women's shelter and stuff, which I don't have on hand, but I will be able to get that as well.
I should have that on my
I
head.
know, right?
Suppress.
Yeah, so
Uh,
what we can always provide those numbers for anyone who wants them. So you can always reach out after the live, and you can DM me, you can DM Riza, and we can always get that information to you if you need to have it to hand.
yeah, and I think a lot of people, like we said, we have increased in Ghana the domestic violence lines. We only
Mm-hmm.
had like a handful, but I've seen as of recently we have like four more new ones, or
Right.
additional ones. And so and I have been saying it all of my lives, like, if you are struggling, if you're having issues, maybe indirectly, if you're fearful of calling or leaving a message, just leave a message saying, I'll call you, and that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
you can, it's related to domestic violence or suicide, that kind of thing, because people will, you're being monitored, right? So, you're at home with the persons who are going to be triggering you and stuff like that. So people may not be able to tell you a whole story over like a
Mm-hmm.
WhatsApp. So being able, if the person sounds like we have more to share, but they're like, oh, I have to go, ask them when is a good time to call them back.
Right. Right. So, Riza, I want to thank you for coming on with me today. And I really appreciate your feedback and your talk and what you spoke about in terms of Guyana and how the suicide rates are, how people can be more at risk to suicide, especially now during COVID. Bless you.
I told you, please. I don't know if anybody
Yes,
knows about
I
me.
saw. Yes. Of course, guys, if you need to reach out to any one of us, you can do that. If you want to reach out to me and then I send on the information to Riza, that can work as well. So however you want to do it, it's quite fine. And I hope that this talk was useful. Riza, anything else you want to add in closing?
Yeah, I was going to say that definitely if, because Barbados and Guyana have a long history, I'm certain that there's peer persons in Barbados who have family in Guyana who they may be having difficulties. So if you're not able to get, if you want, you can go through Brenda, being the Bayesian half of this group of this pair, and then she could pass messages on to me and that we could figure out from there. But also just telling people you can check out the ANIRA Counseling and Psychological Services page, and that is where you'll see like lives and articles and way more information, even numbers for other psychologists and counselors in Guyana. So I would say check out the page, ANIRA, Counseling and Psychological Services.
Great. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day. If you have any more topics that you want us to talk about, to discuss, if you want to see me bring back in anybody else, let me know, and we will bring them back on. Riza, I'm sure, is open to coming back on to discuss anything. Exactly. So there you have it. All right.
Thank you, everyone. See you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. And stay safe.
Up. And Guyana, people, please enjoy the holiday, but, stay safe, because we have a holiday today.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.